HOA thought they could bully me into submission, but when my son's bodyguard answered the door, they realized they had made a huge mistake. What followed left them speechless. The HOA enforcers arrived at the protagonist's home without any prior notice, a tactic they often used to catch homeowners off guard. Their sense of authority was almost palpable as they marched up the front steps, expecting a routine interaction. Their mission was simple: to enforce the HOA's rules, and they believed it would be an easy task. They had done it countless times before, showing up uninvited to issue demands and expecting swift compliance. After all, most homeowners valued peace over conflict and would quickly yield to the pressure of HOA authority. These enforcers were trained to think they held all the cards. Their approach was direct and aggressive, designed to overpower anyone who dared question their judgment. They assumed that the homeowner, like most, would either allow them in or agree to whatever terms they set. The enforcers were convinced that their authority was unquestionable and that their presence alone would be enough to resolve any issues. They were accustomed to homeowners retreating in the face of their demands, afraid of the hassle, the potential fines, or the social consequences of standing up to the HOA. The enforcers felt certain they would get the desired outcome with minimal resistance. As they approached the front door, the enforcers readied themselves for the familiar exchange. They expected the homeowner to answer and immediately comply, either out of fear or a desire to avoid confrontation. They prepared their rehearsed lines, threatening to impose fines, to take legal action, or to escalate the situation further. They had dealt with dozens of similar situations, and this one seemed no different. Everything was going according to plan, or so they thought. However, when the door opened, it wasn't the homeowner who greeted them. Instead, it was the homeowner's son's bodyguard, a towering, muscular figure standing at the door with an air of calm authority. The bodyguard, dressed in black tactical gear, exuded an aura of confidence and control. His posture was impeccable, and his presence immediately changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. This was not the frazzled homeowner they had expected to face, nor someone who would cower at the mention of HOA rules and regulations. The enforcers were taken aback. The bodyguard's stoic expression and commanding presence shifted the power dynamic instantly, putting the enforcers on edge. The enforcers, who had initially felt in control, now found themselves questioning their approach. They had no training in dealing with someone like this. The bodyguard's size, his posture, and the calm but undeniable authority with which he stood made them hesitate. They were not dealing with an average homeowner, nor were they facing someone intimidated by their power. The bodyguard's unflinching demeanor and the quiet confidence he projected immediately let the enforcers know they were dealing with someone who knew how to manage high-pressure situations. This unexpected turn of events set the stage for an entirely different kind of interaction than the enforcers were used to. They were used to getting immediate results by relying on their aggressive tactics, and they assumed that by simply showing up, they could assert their control over the homeowner. But this time, things were different. They were confronted with a professional, someone who had spent years training for situations far more dangerous and complex than a simple dispute over property rules. The bodyguard's calmness, strength, and unwavering presence made it clear that the enforcers could not simply bulldoze their way through this encounter. As the enforcers stood at the doorstep, they were left with a choice. They could attempt to press forward with their usual tactics, but the bodyguard's mere presence told them that would be unwise. The dynamic had already shifted. The bodyguard had done nothing but stand his ground, yet he had already claimed control of the situation. This subtle power shift left the enforcers in a precarious position. They had come with the expectation of asserting their authority over an intimidated homeowner, but now they were faced with someone who was more than capable of handling their threats and intimidation. The shift in power was immediate, and the enforcers had to reassess their approach. They no longer had the advantage of surprise, nor did they have the comfort of knowing they could easily push the homeowner around. The bodyguard's presence alone made it clear that they would need to rethink their approach. The enforcers, who had planned to be the ones calling the shots, were now in a situation where they had to decide how to proceed without overstepping their boundaries. This was the moment that marked the beginning of a very different kind of confrontation. The enforcers realized they were up against someone who was unshaken, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by their threats or their assumed authority. The bodyguard's unwavering calmness not only diffused the tension, but also made the enforcers second-guess their own authority. This subtle shift in power, from the enforcer's assumption of control to the bodyguard's quiet command, was the catalyst that set the stage for the rest of the encounter. In this first interaction, the bodyguard had already shown the enforcers that their typical methods of intimidation and pressure would not work here. This was not a standard encounter with a homeowner who would buckle under pressure. The enforcers were now confronted with someone who had been trained to handle far more intense situations, and that realization would shape the rest of the confrontation. Fisakar. Bodyguard's presence was not by accident. His role was a reflection of years of intense training, discipline, and professional experience. Unlike most individuals, he had not only been trained to handle basic security duties, but he had undergone specialized instruction designed for the highest levels of protection. His career was built on a foundation of protecting those who were often at the center of public attention, people whose lives were at constant risk due to their status and visibility. Over the years, he had developed an unparalleled ability to handle high-pressure situations, to remain composed in the face of danger, and to make life-altering decisions with remarkable speed and precision. His training began in some of the most challenging and competitive environments where only the strongest, most disciplined individuals succeeded. The bodyguard had worked with elite security firms, where he was groomed not only in the physical aspects of protection, but also in the psychological skills necessary to assess and diffuse potential threats. His role often required him to think several steps ahead, to anticipate dangers before they materialized, and to remain level-headed in the most chaotic of situations. This type of training did not just involve physical combat or tactical maneuvers, but also a mental fortitude that allowed him to evaluate the risks of a situation and respond accordingly. One of the key components of his training was situational awareness. In the world of high-level security, danger often comes in unpredictable forms. Whether it's a close-range confrontation, a threat in the form of a psychological attack, or a potential ambush, the bodyguard was trained to notice the smallest details: someone's nervous behavior, an unexpected movement, or an inconspicuous object that could pose a risk. This constant state of alertness and evaluation became second nature to him. His eyes were always scanning, his mind always calculating the next step, the best response to any potential threat. The bodyguard's calm demeanor was not just a product of his professional training, but also of his ability to remain acutely aware of his surroundings, constantly processing information and making decisions in real time. He had also undergone extensive combat training, preparing him for any potential physical confrontations. This training was not just about brute strength. It was about precision, strategy, and efficiency. The bodyguard was taught to neutralize threats with the least amount of force necessary, understanding that in high-stakes situations, every move counted. Whether he was facing an unarmed assailant or dealing with an armed adversary, his training allowed him to maintain control and act swiftly without hesitation. He knew that when it came to protecting high-profile individuals, there was no room for error. Every move had to be calculated, every decision had to be deliberate. In addition to physical and tactical training, the bodyguard also had to master the art of diplomacy and discretion. In his line of work, he often had to navigate complex social situations where being too aggressive could escalate tensions, but being too passive could leave his client vulnerable. He was trained to manage interactions with a variety of people, from the most influential political figures to members of the public, always balancing the need to maintain security with the necessity of preserving privacy and fostering trust. His ability to engage with people, to read their intentions, and to de-escalate potentially volatile situations without resorting to violence was a crucial aspect of his role. It was this blend of strength, strategy, and diplomacy that made him an exceptional bodyguard, and why he was trusted with the safety of individuals whose lives were often at risk from those with far more malicious intent. As the bodyguard's career progressed, he was called upon to protect some of the most high-profile individuals in the world, from heads of state to Fortune 500 executives. Each assignment tested his skills in different ways, challenging him to think on his feet, adapt to rapidly changing environments, and constantly reassess the level of threat. He had been trained to handle everything from large-scale security breaches to intimate personal threats. His reputation grew, and he became known not only for his physical prowess, but for his ability to remain calm under the most intense pressure. He was someone who could be trusted with the protection of the most vulnerable individuals, someone who had the ability to navigate the most dangerous situations without losing focus. The bodyguard's role within the protagonist's family was a direct result of these years of training. Despite the family's seemingly ordinary lifestyle, they had access to the very best in personal security. The bodyguard's presence was not a sign of excess, but a necessity, a safeguard against threats that could arise without warning. His expertise provided a layer of protection that ensured the safety of the family, allowing them to live their lives without fear of intrusion. The family was aware that, while their daily lives might seem typical, they were backed by professionals who had been trained to handle situations far more dangerous than an HOA dispute. The enforcers, accustomed to confronting average homeowners who may not have the training or the resolve to stand their ground, were completely unprepared for what they encountered. They were used to situations where intimidation and aggressive tactics would force compliance. But facing someone who had spent years protecting high-profile figures, someone trained to assess threats and remain composed under pressure, was an entirely different challenge. The enforcers quickly realized that they were no longer in control of the situation and that their usual tactics would have no effect on the bodyguard, who stood his ground without flinching. This section highlights the difference between the world of professional security and the mundane world of HOA disputes. While the enforcers believed they could intimidate an average homeowner, they were unprepared for the level of training and composure the bodyguard brought to the situation. His background, experience, and calm under pressure were the very qualities that allowed him to stand firm and neutralize any attempt at intimidation. The enforcers, accustomed to having the upper hand, now found themselves in unfamiliar territory, facing someone who could not only handle the pressure, but use it to his advantage. The enforcers, accustomed to using their position of authority to quickly achieve their goals, suddenly found themselves in uncharted territory. They had walked up to the door with confidence, believing that their presence alone would be enough to assert control and settle the issue at hand. In their experience, homeowners typically reacted to their demands by either complying immediately or becoming flustered, at which point the enforcers could easily take advantage of the situation. However, in this instance, they were faced with someone who refused to be intimidated, someone who exuded an unshakable sense of calm authority. At first, the enforcers tried to assert themselves with the same tactics they always used. They raised their voices and issued their demands, expecting that the homeowner would either agree or feel cornered into submission. They were certain that their usual approach, which had worked countless times before, would lead to the desired outcome. But this time, they encountered resistance. The bodyguard, standing firmly at the door, did not waver in the face of their aggression. His demeanor was calm but commanding, and his silence spoke volumes. He didn't engage in the back and forth that the enforcers expected. Instead, he simply stood his ground with quiet strength. This shift in dynamic made the enforcers pause. They had assumed that the homeowner would be a compliant, passive participant in the interaction, but the bodyguard's presence challenged their assumptions. What they initially saw as a simple confrontation quickly became something more complicated. The enforcers were now faced with a professional who had spent years learning to handle high-stress situations, and his unwavering composure made it clear that their usual tactics of intimidation were not going to work. As the enforcers attempted to press forward, they began to notice a subtle shift in their own mindset. Their initial confidence began to crack. They were used to holding the upper hand, to controlling situations through their presumed authority. But this time, the bodyguard was not reacting to their intimidation. His calm demeanor forced them to reassess their position, to question whether they had truly accounted for all factors in this confrontation. What had been a routine visit to enforce property rules was quickly becoming a situation where they were no longer in control. The enforcers began to realize that their power was not absolute. The bodyguard's ability to remain composed in the face of their attempts to dominate the conversation exposed a critical weakness in their approach. The enforcers depended on the reaction of others. Their authority was tied to their ability to make people comply with their demands, and when that compliance didn't come naturally, they struggled to adapt. They had assumed that the homeowner would be intimidated and that their position of power would be enough to force a resolution. But the bodyguard's presence served as a stark reminder that intimidation works only when the other party is susceptible to it. This realization began to undermine their confidence. The enforcers found themselves second-guessing their approach. They had assumed they could use their usual strategy to manipulate the situation in their favor, but now they were confronted with a person who was not easily manipulated. The bodyguard's lack of emotional reaction made the enforcers feel as if they were the ones who were under scrutiny. It was as though the power dynamics had shifted, and they were no longer the ones controlling the interaction. The tension began to mount as the enforcers struggled to regain their footing. They were used to people bending to their will, whether out of fear or frustration. They had never encountered someone like the bodyguard, who seemed completely unaffected by their attempts at intimidation. The bodyguard's strength was not just in his physical presence, but in his ability to control the situation through sheer mental discipline. He didn't need to assert his dominance verbally or through aggressive actions. His silence, his calmness, and his unwavering presence were enough to throw the enforcers off balance. As they tried to push forward, the enforcers became more self-conscious. They were unsure of how to proceed, caught between their desire to continue asserting their authority and the growing awareness that they were no longer in control. They began to hesitate, questioning whether continuing to push would escalate the situation further. The bodyguard's professional demeanor had made it clear that the confrontation would not be resolved through forceful tactics or intimidation, and the enforcers found themselves struggling to find a way to regain the upper hand. What had initially seemed like a simple confrontation over property rules had become a battle of wills. The enforcers, who had walked up to the door expecting to assert their power with ease, were now forced to reevaluate their position. The bodyguard had not needed to speak or act aggressively. His mere presence had shifted the balance of power, and the enforcers could no longer rely on their usual methods to win the confrontation. This moment of realization was pivotal for the enforcers. It made them question the limitations of their authority and the effectiveness of their usual approach. The bodyguard had shown them that true power was not always about loud assertions or physical dominance. Sometimes the ability to remain calm, composed, and unfazed by external pressure is the strongest weapon of all. The enforcers had underestimated the situation, and now they were left to grapple with the fact that they no longer held the power they had assumed they would. The bodyguard's steady presence had not only diffused their intimidation tactics, but had also forced them to confront their own limitations and rethink how they approached authority and control. The power of composure in any situation cannot be overstated, especially when faced with aggression and attempts at intimidation. In high-stakes confrontations, such as those involving authority figures or individuals trying to impose their will, remaining calm is not just a defensive tactic. It is an active form of strength. The bodyguard's ability to remain composed, no matter how loud or forceful the enforcers became, exemplified the true power that lies in emotional control. This composure did not come from passivity or fear of escalation. Rather, it stemmed from years of training, a deep understanding of human behavior, and a sense of confidence in one's ability to manage conflict without resorting to aggression. In most situations, when confronted with heightened tension or authority, individuals might feel pressured to react, either by defending themselves aggressively or by backing down to avoid further conflict. However, the bodyguard demonstrated that the true strength lies in not allowing external pressure to dictate one's response. His ability to stay calm, despite the enforcer's attempts to dominate, not only neutralized the aggressive tactics used, but also exposed a critical flaw in their approach. The enforcers relied on the escalation of the confrontation, raising their voices, issuing commands, and attempting to push the homeowner into submission. But the bodyguard's response was not one of hostility or retreat. Instead, it was one of measured control. The bodyguard's calmness reflected his professional training. As part of his security background, he had been conditioned to handle tense situations without losing focus. His training involved a deep understanding of how to read people, assess their behavior, and determine the most effective way to handle conflict. In moments of pressure, when others might panic or react impulsively, the bodyguard's training allowed him to stay composed and think critically. His response was never hurried or emotional. Instead, he took his time, assessing the situation and choosing his words carefully, ensuring that every response was deliberate and calculated. In addition to his training, the bodyguard's calmness stemmed from an intrinsic belief that strength does not require aggression. Strength is often perceived as physical force or loud confrontation, but true strength, as the bodyguard exemplified, lies in the ability to control oneself and a situation without escalating it unnecessarily. In his years of protecting high-profile individuals, he had learned that maintaining control was not about overpowering others physically, but about exerting influence through composure. By remaining calm, he kept the situation from spiraling into something more volatile. His presence alone was enough to shift the dynamics of the encounter, and his calm authority neutralized the enforcer's attempts to dominate. Furthermore, the bodyguard's calm demeanor served as a reminder of the importance of mental discipline. In confrontational situations, especially those that involve power struggles, emotions often cloud judgment and lead to impulsive reactions. However, by maintaining his composure, the bodyguard was able to think clearly and strategically. His mental clarity allowed him to respond to the enforcer's demands without being swayed by their pressure tactics. While the enforcers may have tried to rattle him with their aggression, the bodyguard's steadiness ensured that their attempts were futile. One of the key aspects of the bodyguard's ability to maintain composure was his ability to manage his own emotions. Emotional regulation is a crucial skill in high-pressure situations, and the bodyguard had mastered this art. When others might have felt frustration, anger, or fear in the face of intimidation, the bodyguard stayed composed and in control of his emotions. This emotional stability allowed him to assess the situation from an objective perspective, rather than being swept up in the immediate emotions of the moment. His ability to control his emotions not only made him more effective in handling the situation, but also conveyed a sense of authority to those around him. The enforcers, who had expected to dominate the situation through their loud and aggressive behavior, were left unsettled by the bodyguard's unwavering calm. His emotional control sent a clear message that he was not easily intimidated, and that the situation would only escalate if they allowed it to. In the context of the family, the bodyguard's ability to remain composed was also a reflection of the values instilled within the family over time. Strength was not measured by the ability to physically overpower others, but by the ability to control one's emotions, make rational decisions under pressure, and stand firm without resorting to aggression. The family had learned that true strength is not about how loudly you speak or how forcefully you act, but how you carry yourself in the face of conflict. This was a lesson they had absorbed from their experiences with the bodyguard. His example taught them that in moments of stress or confrontation, the best way to navigate the situation was through calmness, confidence, and thoughtful action. In addition to providing physical protection, the bodyguard had become a mentor of sorts, demonstrating to the family how to handle pressure and intimidation with grace. His composure was not just a tool for diffusing dangerous situations, it was also a teaching moment. Through his example, the family learned the importance of emotional intelligence, of staying grounded and maintaining control when faced with challenges. The bodyguard's influence extended beyond physical security. It had become a guiding principle for how to approach life's more difficult moments with steadiness and resolve. In the end, the bodyguard's composure was the key factor that turned the tide of the situation. While the enforcers expected to intimidate the homeowner into submission, they found themselves disarmed by the bodyguard's calm authority. Their aggression had no effect, and their power over the situation quickly dissipated. The bodyguard's ability to remain calm in the face of intimidation not only neutralized the enforcers' tactics, but also left them questioning their approach. The true lesson from this confrontation was that maintaining composure in the face of aggression can be far more powerful than any physical confrontation. The bodyguard's calmness, strategic thinking, and emotional control were what ultimately allowed him to manage the situation with authority and resolve, ensuring that the outcome remained in his hands. As the confrontation progressed, it became clear to the enforcers that their usual tactics of intimidation and forceful demands had failed to achieve the desired result. They had come expecting to walk away with compliance, expecting the homeowner to yield to their authority and submit to their rules without resistance. This was how most of their encounters had gone in the past. People were often intimidated by the forceful presence of the HOA enforcers, fearful of the consequences, and ready to give in just to avoid further escalation. However, in this case, the enforcers quickly realized that they were facing someone who would not bend under pressure. The bodyguard's silent but unwavering authority had taken the wind out of the enforcers' sails. The confidence that had initially propelled them forward was rapidly evaporating. What had been a simple task for them, enforcing property rules, had turned into an unexpected power struggle. The enforcers, who were used to being the dominant force in their interactions, found themselves at a standstill, unable to proceed with their usual approach. Their initial attempts to push their demands onto the homeowner through loud voices and assertive commands had no effect on the bodyguard. His calm presence, unbothered by their aggression, had created an impenetrable barrier that made it clear they could not win this confrontation through intimidation alone. The shift in power dynamics was palpable. The enforcers, who had come expecting an easy victory, were now faced with the reality that they were not in control. The bodyguard's composure, coupled with his commanding demeanor, made it evident that any further escalation would not end in their favor. The more they pressed, the more they realized they were simply pushing against a wall. There was no crack, no weakness to exploit. The bodyguard did not need to shout, to raise his voice, or to physically intervene. His ability to remain poised and in control had made it clear that this situation would not escalate further unless they chose to take it there. The realization hit the enforcers slowly, but it was undeniable. The bodyguard's steady presence had neutralized their attempts at intimidation. The enforcers began to see that they were facing an individual who could handle far more than the typical HOA dispute. They recognized that no matter how forcefully they tried to assert themselves, they would not be able to sway the bodyguard's resolve. What they had initially thought would be a brief and easy interaction had transformed into a battle of wills, and in this battle, the bodyguard had already won. As the enforcers continued to hesitate, their authority began to erode. Their earlier certainty and belief that they could push the homeowner into submission faded as they realized that the bodyguard was not going to back down. With each moment that passed, their confidence diminished, and they grew increasingly uncertain about how to proceed. What had once seemed like an open and shut case was now an unpredictable standoff. The bodyguard's calmness was a reminder that not all confrontations could be resolved with force or aggression. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was the ability to remain composed and assertive without ever needing to escalate the situation. In this moment, the enforcers were faced with an uncomfortable truth. They were no longer in control, and their usual methods of intimidation were ineffective. The bodyguard had proven that strength was not always about raising one's voice or acting aggressively. It was about having the self-control to remain steady, to refuse to yield to pressure, and to maintain control of the situation with quiet authority. The enforcers, who had relied on their ability to overpower others, were now witnessing the strength of someone who understood that true power often lies in the ability to remain calm and collected in the face of challenge. As the bodyguard's silent dominance became clear, the enforcers began to back off. Their attempts to escalate the situation were met with unwavering resolve, and they realized that continuing to press for compliance would only further expose their inability to assert control. Their once confident posture softened, and they started to reassess their options. It was becoming evident that pressing further would not only waste time, but could also result in unnecessary conflict. The enforcers, who had come expecting a quick resolution, now found themselves retreating. The situation was no longer in their favor, and they understood that any further attempt to push their demands would be futile. In the end, the enforcers chose to back down. The standoff had ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the realization that true strength came from composure, not aggression. The bodyguard's ability to remain steady and in control without resorting to force or loud demands had won the day. What was initially meant to be a simple enforcement of HOA rules had turned into a powerful reminder that power is not always about exerting control over others. It is often about knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. The enforcers had been forced to recognize this truth, and in doing so, they chose to disengage, unwilling to escalate the situation any further. This encounter, which had begun with an attempt at intimidation, ended with the enforcers realizing that their usual tactics had no place here. The bodyguard's strength, rooted in his calmness, his control, and his unwavering resolve, had neutralized their attempts to dominate the situation. What the enforcers had hoped to achieve through force, the bodyguard had thwarted with composure. In the end, it was clear that the protagonist's family, through sheer mental strength and steadiness, had won the encounter without ever needing to raise their voices or engage in physical confrontation. The enforcers had backed down, not because they were outmatched physically, but because the bodyguard had shown them that true power lies in the ability to remain steady and in control, no matter the situation. Want to hear more stories of unexpected confrontations and how calm authority prevails? Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more.